Hello, everybody. All right, 35 years later, Waterworld. Before we get on, how many people was this your first time seeing it on the big screen? The big screen. Isn't that great? All right, no, yeah, it's absolutely wild. All right, let's maybe start a little bit from the beginning. Let's learn a little bit about Peter. What was a little bit of your your creative upbringing? Were you in a showbiz family? How'd you get started in the world of storytelling?
I'm the son of an architect who wanted to be a screenwriter, so I fulfilled his fantasies. And I actually grew up in Italy, of all places, and I have friends from Italy in the house right there, a family visiting. And it's his birthday, my friend Francis.
Happy birthday. What a coincidence.
It's your birthday?
It's mine too.
Oh my God. Cool. Well, thank you for having me.
That's another good reason for choosing a Waterworld. I couldn't pass it up on doing something on my birthday.
It's interesting. You mentioned 35 years, so that's an important number. But in fact, I wrote it even before that. The original draft of this was 1986. I wrote it on the very first model Macintosh, the one that that they did that, and then I sort of set it aside for a few years because I was pursuing some directing. Actually, I directed a couple of low-budget movies, and then I dusted it off in 1989, did a quick rewrite, and it sold. And then they started making the movie, and 5 years later, in 1995, is when it actually hit the screens.
All right, that's absolutely wild. So let's say where are you when you find out that it's sold, and then what's it like finding out that Kevin Costner gets attached to it? What's that about?
So that was much later. I actually should tell you the origin story because it's amusing. So I was in my 20s. I was 26, and I was hustling and trying to break into the movie business. And I had some friends who worked at Roger Corman's company. And I had a meeting with a guy named Brad Cravoy, who has gone on to produce some Farrelly Brothers movies, and but at that time he was just like a hustler, just like me. He was trying to produce, and he said to me, "Peter, I have some South African money. If you write me a Mad Max ripoff, I'll let you direct it." So I had two moral questions facing me at that point, that juncture. One was, do I take the South African blood money for the chance to direct? Because it was pre-apartheid. And unfortunately, the answer to that question was yes. However, was I willing to write another Mad Max ripoff? And everyone was doing that at the time. It was just, that's the cheapest way to make an action movie. You just get a bunch of beat-up cars, 3 barrels of gasoline and some guns, and go in the desert and make a movie. They would make them in a weekend. There were hundreds of them, and they were being sold at the American film market. And it just felt thankless, and it wouldn't be anything that I would want to direct. So I was walking around the marina in LA, and it just sort of hit me like an epiphany. Let's just set it on water. Let's just, change the genre by making that one change. And I went in to pitch Brad Cravoy with my brilliant eureka. And I think the number that he had in mind for the budget of his movie was $100,000. So I said, Brad, I've got it. We're going to set it on water. And he goes, are you out of your mind, Peter? A movie like that? That'll cost us $5 million to make. So we parted ways, and I said, it's a good idea. I'm going to write it anyway. So I wrote it on spec. But back to that question that I posed earlier, it is a Western, and it is based on, do we have any guesses? Shane. Who said Shane? Yeah, Shane. Especially the friendship between the lone cowboy and the young kid. And in the case of Shane, it was a little boy. But I very much took that as a template. I thought that was such a strong movie, the mysterious guy with a past, with a history, with violence, with trauma, with who knows what, when happened to him, and yet beneath all that, he's got a heart, and the little girl brings him, out, essentially. And one of the biggest compliments that I have received from people is women in their 30s who have seen this movie say, oh my God, I was so glad to see that type of a role model I was so sick of the Disney princesses, and here's this really tough, fierce, cool girl, and her performance is so good, who, tames the wild beast, and brings out his heart. So that's the origin story.
And in your original drafts too, you really were provided some great female characters. There were a lot more than made it up onto screen, you can probably find on YouTube there's people who did an audio drama of one of his drafts, and it's just wild hearing some of the differences. What are some of the things that made it to screen that you're glad made it all the way through? But then tell us about some of the world that was envisioned before changes were made and other writers came on board.
Yeah, that's a good question. So there is this sort of a hodgepodge feeling to this movie, and that's because of the nature of Hollywood development hell, especially when you make a movie of this scale. It was briefly, probably for about 5 minutes, the most expensive movie ever made, at $180 million back in '95. So that was a lot of money, but it was very quickly eclipsed. But essentially, when these movies are developed, I was so naive, I was so green, I was in my 20s. I didn't realize that, they were going to write this thing into the ground, hire 5 more writers, and then just keep making it kind of worse. The most heartbreaking moment for me was about a month before production. One of the producers, Chuck Gordon, Larry's brother, took me out to lunch, and he said, Peter, we still don't have a script that's as good as your original spec script. And I'm like, oh my God, can't you just shoot it? And he said, no, the train has left the station. We've built sets or whatever. And that's a little bit heartbreaking to hear, but it is the nature of movies of this scale and Hollywood. And what happens is it gets so eclectic and sort of weird. What's up with that kind of chitty bang bang floating device that just shows up Deus Ex Machina, and they can't even do a wide shot of it. It's just so bizarre. That's a weird thing. And even though I loved David Toohey, was the largest contributing writer. So in the arbitration, the Writers Guild, co-awarded us screenwriting or whatever, written by credit. He came up with the whole idea of smokers and the fact that they would always be smoking. But where do they get the cigarettes from? That's always been a little bit of a head scratcher for me. And so there's a lot of things that are sort of odd and bizarre. And then certain things were repurposed. For instance, that was not the way I used the Exxon Valdez. I used it completely differently. In fact, it was mystical and amazing. And it was, I'm not going to say more than that because, something's coming. But it was a completely different use of that very big element. And Kevin Reynolds had a conversation with me. When Kevin Costner came aboard, I had done 7 drafts or so, and they kept saying, make it grittier, make it darker, make it more cyberpunk. I was like, well, what's cyberpunk? It was kind of like losing the magic and the little bit of the mysticism that I had, in the original. And what did I know? I was just, trying to get a movie made. So, but Kevin Reynolds, finally, the way that I found out that Costner was attached is I had a friend, another writer, who had a deal at Universal, and she was driving along in one of those golf carts to get to her office or whatever, and she passed Costner talking to this other person in a suit. And as she passed, she heard one word, Waterworld. And she called me up, she goes, is Kevin Costner attached to Waterworld? And I said, I don't know. I called my agent, which was CIA at the time, and I said, Ken, is Costner attached to Waterworld? He goes, how did you find that out? It was like, yes, he had decided that he was interested in that movie, and then, of course, he brings in his team, which includes his writers and, in this case, Kevin Reynolds. I heard at one point that he turned down Robert Zemeckis to direct this, which is another little bit of a heartbreak. That would have been an interesting movie. Kevin Reynolds, of course, he had worked with him a lot, and he knew he could control him, and he kind of took over the movie, and there's all that stuff. But I had a lot more epigenesis in my original script. Like, they have the gills and the web feet and stuff, but there was all sorts of really interesting mutations that were happening that I sort of miss.
No, yeah, that sounds like a much more fantastical and like fun, like a world that could be explored. But they did create one extension of the movie, which was, of course, the theme park show over at Universal Studios, and much in the same way that Back to the Future, deep cut people will know, Crispin Glover had to, fight for his rights when they used his image without his consent in the second film. In a similar way, you triumphed for writers for compensation with the theme park show.
Yeah, a year or two after the movie was released, we were approached by the Writers Guild, who said, we would like to arbitrate, we'd like to essentially sue Universal on your behalf. Are you willing to do that? We think that we can get you compensated for the theme park use of your material. Myself and David Toohey, at that point, the two credited writers. And we said, why not? And it ended up being a 5-year arbitration, and they argued, for those of you that know the way the Writers Guild works, you assign your copyright. When you sell a movie in Hollywood, you have to release your copyright. However, there are certain reserved rights that are called separated rights that the original writer, the credited writer retains. Book publishing, dramatic adaptations, so theater, and some merchandising rights. And they said, we think that essentially the stunt show is a dramatic adaptation of the movie. It's the same characters, it's the same story, it's the same stakes, it's, the setting, all of it is the same. So we prevailed, and they threw a bucket of money to try to avoid that, but they, made a settlement with us, and then we established that precedent. So from now on, any writer whose movie's made into a theme park attraction gets a minimum guarantee, and you could argue, you could negotiate above that. If you have clout, if your last name is Crichton or Spielberg, you're going to get more than the minimum.
Well, all right, isn't that great?
And also, that's another myth that I would like to disabuse. It's more or less being disabused. That Waterworld was a flop. It is so not a flop. It's actually one of the most valuable movies in the Universal catalog because of the theme park revenues. So if you do the math, this has been running at 4 theme parks for 25 years, 365 days a year, at least 12 shows a day, and the arenas seat 3,000. So that's 30 million people who have seen, who have been exposed to this title. So that's a lot of revenue. They've gotten a lot out of this title. So I'm proud of that, and I'm also proud that now writers get paid for theme parks.
Have you gotten to visit any of the outside of Universal over here? Like, have you gone to the zone? Like they created a whole land.
Yeah, I have not visited. Has anyone been to a Universal theme park, not the Hollywood one? Over there. Did you go to the Waterworld ride? Where?
I didn't go to the ride, but I've been to one in Orlando.
And do they have the Waterworld attraction there?
I don't think they did at the time, because this was maybe 20 years ago.
I don't think that one has it, but I think it's in Osaka, it's in Beijing, it might be in Singapore. And in Beijing, what's interesting is that instead of just the stunt show in the arena, they actually have a whole Waterworld zone, which includes like a cantina where you can get food, and then there's a souvenir shop, the Waterworld. So you're entering Waterworld land, and that's unheard of for a one-title franchise. That's usually Transformers or Jurassic World or whatever, or Harry Potter. You get 8, 9 titles, and then you create a zone. But in this case, and I think it has to do with the fact that this myth has kind of like really captured people's imagination. And of course it's based on the flood myth. It's something that is so baked into our storytelling DNA. I mean, we all probably have some visceral, ancestral, traumatic memory of something like this kind of happening at one point, And I think that in certain cultures, perhaps China being one of them, there's a real thirst for this story and this world. So they made a zone.
Now I'm gonna take some questions in just a little bit. I'll give you some time to think about your questions. Think of some good ones. Be classy and don't be weird. And if you have to think about it, maybe err on the side of caution. Let's see. Do you want to talk about anything that you might be working on coming up, or do you want to maybe save that for after we've taken some audience questions?
Well, if you asked, okay. So we have actually reacquired the copyright to Waterworld. There is a provision in the federal copyright statute that says 35 years after the date of transfer, a copyright owner is entitled to say, I want it back. I want to do something with it, especially a title like this where they haven't done anything with it. So we were approached by an attorney who specializes in this, and as of March 27th this year, we got the rights back, and we are developing a book called Waterworld Reborn.
Are there any projections on when we might be able to expect to be able to put that on our shelf?
Say it again?
Are there any projections on when we might be able to get that on our shelf, on our bookshelf?
Oh, bookshelf. So when is it going to be out? No, we don't know that yet. But
I worded that weird. What did I warn you about?
Oh, but I do want to give proper credit for that idea. So I told you a story before the screening that my wife had seen the movie before me, and she said it's not my kind of film. And we have slightly different sensibilities, and certainly at that time I was very squarely in my overachieving ego. And she was saying that there was a certain misogyny to the movie, and there is. It's kind of like, okay, that's the nature of the character a little bit. But Paola, for years, has been telling me, we've got to do something with this title. We've got to resurrect this title. And she came up with the idea, well, I think you can guess where this is going. Who's the lead of the new movie? Enola. She's now in her 30s, and she's got some things to say. And that was Paola's idea, and we developed the story together. And I'm really excited about it.
All right. Does Paula want to give a little, wait? No, don't. Anyways, now I'll take it to the audience. Does anyone have any questions? I'll go run out over to you. Go ahead and give me, I'll be right there.
Yes, hi. How long did it take to write your first draft?
So this is going to sound surprising, but this is the nature of beginner's mind and fearlessness. 3 weeks. It just poured out of me. That's because I didn't know the rules, and I didn't know all the rules that I was breaking in writing a world like this. I think he's coming around with the mic.
Were you on location at all?
I did visit the set. That was a really interesting experience. The set was filmed off of the big island of Hawaii, off the west coast, and just prior to production, that whole atoll, which Kevin Reynolds wanted it to be gritty and rusty and real, and he apparently had a conversation with Steven Spielberg before making the movie, saying, "You got any advice? I'm shooting on water." And Spielberg said, "Don't shoot on water." He just said, "Just don't do it. Whatever, shoot as much as you can in a tank or on a stage. Do green screen." This was, by the way, all those effects are practical, and there's no drones. Those are helicopters doing those aerial shots. All those explosions, real to scale. No CGI, no digital. So Spielberg says, don't shoot on water. And for some reason, Kevin Reynolds decided to not listen to the most successful director of all time. So they were going to shoot it practically, and they built that whole atoll. It was a practical set, and there was a hurricane, and it sank. It sank a couple months before production. They had to rebuild it. This is one of the reasons why the budget started to balloon. But another reason is, to create the sense of being surrounded by water, you have to sail far from shore, with all these boats. You have to sail a couple miles or whatever to have a feeling of, being 360 degrees of water. That means there's the picture boat, there's the camera boat, there's the catering boat, there's the bathroom, there's the hair and makeup boat, there's the prop boat. Like, all this whole flotilla needs to mobilize and get out there with safety. And so even if you have a 6 a.m. call time, you're not getting your first shot until like noon. And then they would get, 4 setups, and that would be it. And then, the one shot they would get was the money shot, the sunset shot. Like, let's get that shot, the silhouette of the boat. There's a lot of beautiful shots like that. But it ends up being this kind of like a slightly ugly movie because the sun is mostly overhead. And that's the nature. So here I was, young, naive, idealistic screenwriter visiting the set, and I'm maybe 3 weeks into production, and they're like, I don't even know how this math works, but I think they were 4 weeks late. So everyone is looking at me like, you're the asshole who wrote this thing? I was really getting a lot of glares. And also there was all sorts of crazy stuff going on. Costner's marriage was falling apart, and there was scandals. And so it was a bit of a tense set when I visited it. But it was kind of fun. Who else?
So I'm going to try to rein in this question a little bit, but I loved hearing how difficult it was to make this, because I think now where Hollywood is, everything is so easy and efficient. Like, it's all about how quick can we do it, and it kind of relates to AI. This question, I guess. I write myself, not screenplays, but I taught a dramatic writing class to high school students, and they would just be thrilled to be here right now. But my question is, how much do you think the industry has changed since this movie was made, and how much of that is because of AI? And what advice do you have to young screenwriters?
There's a bunch of questions in there. Let's
Yeah.
see. Okay, so one is, I'm going to start with the last. The genie is out of the bottle on AI. The sooner you embrace it, the better off you're going to be, because it's not going away. And it doesn't have to be an enemy. It can actually be quite a powerful ally. I use AI all the time right now. I'm not having AI do my writing, but it's doing my research. I'm bouncing ideas. It's like I have a writer's room. I have a really good collaborator. AI is a really powerful tool. And it's getting better all the time. And there's a whole bunch to choose from right now. I think it's very much worth exploring AI. In terms of production, it's also just going to completely change the game. Tyler Perry abandoned a plan to spend $800 million building a whole production facility in the South. I think it was in Georgia, because it's like, we don't need production facilities anymore. So much of this movie could have been digitally created, brilliantly. And in fact, I mentioned Zemeckis earlier. It was just a few years after this movie that he did Castaway. And those gigantic ocean waves at night were digital. All that water movement, was just a few years after, could have saved so much money on this movie. So that's the inevitable direction the business is going in. And there is a lot of skittishness and fear, obviously, for all of us creators and also actors. It's like extras. Forget about it. You don't need extras anymore. And even leading, actors, movie stars are now considering making avatars and licensing, their performance rights. So it's kind of a crazy new world, but it's here and it's not going away. So let's figure out how to do that dance, in a way that maintains our creativity and vision. Yes.
Hi, my name is Andrea. I was also appreciative that you brought up the fact that Kevin Costner's relationship was kind of hanging by a thread, but because of, you worked with the actors, do you still, I have two questions. Are you still in contact with some of the actors, and have they mentioned, oh, my career was made because of this movie, or I still get people coming up to me on the street because of this movie?
I'm the only one that I've run into is Jean Triplehorn. I've seen her a couple times at various events, and we just look at each other and kind of like roll our eyes. It's like, what a crazy ride that was, I don't think anyone's career was made by this, or actually the crew. Everyone who worked on this movie ended up like buying homes and getting all sorts of things because it was a really long production. In terms of the, above the line, not so much. I think it's interesting. There was so much writing at the time, calling it like Fishtar or Kevin's Gate, or all these like disparaging comments about what a flop it was, and that was going to tank Costner's career. Costner's doing just fine, as we know, and it ends up being kind of a iconic kind of cult classic that I think people still appreciate.
Do you have like a favorite part of the movie that you that came out of the movie as the writer? Something that like really stood out?
Interesting. I like the moment when Enola opens the music box and says, "I'm home." To me, that's a very touching moment, and I was, wondering whether that landed, this idea, like what's the mythology, the Enola mythology. It was written in much more detail and granularity in various drafts, and I've always wondered, how clear it is. Like, can someone tell me exactly what happened to Enola? I'm not sure. Perhaps the ones who've watched it 10 times can, but I think that's a very interesting moment because it's like it's on multiple levels what that means, that moment of returning home. And there's a moment that's missing that I sort of miss, which is what is that island?
Everest.
Yeah, it's Everest. And how do you know that?
I've watched the extended cut of the film.
Yeah. Okay. So that should have been in there because that's really kind of cinches that's the sort of Planet of the Apes, Statue of Liberty moment, right? Which is like, oh wow, that's what that is. And the underwater sequence is a little bit of a throwaway. Like, what is that? Is that New York? Like, why couldn't we have shown what that was more specifically? I thought that Eiffel Tower. Show me. In fact, I think I wrote a draft with an Eiffel Tower in it. Something more iconic underwater would have been cool. But yeah, I love him up on the mast. That's a practical stunt. Costner was up on that mast. And that was a helicopter shot. Not a drone shot. And I also have to say I love what they did with the Universal logo. I had thought of doing stuff like that, myself. Like, how can you really get into this world? How can you nail? And the first scene, the urination, because that really sets up the world visually, and without any words, exactly what the stakes are. He's got to drink his own piss, and then he's got to share it with his plant. Okay, now I get it. Water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. Does my friend Bob want to ask a question?
I do. I don't need to stick the microphone. I wonder, when's the last time you saw it in a movie theater?
Oh, that's a great question. And I want to shout out, thank you so much, Cody, for inviting me and for this event, because It was such a treat to see. This is a DCP. This is a digital print. It was beautiful up on that screen. I did a screening event earlier in this year at Quentin Tarantino's theater, the Vista, in LA, and they literally projected a VHS copy. So it was like, oh my God. So it was so nice to see it. But I did see it, 3 months ago, Bob.
But that wouldn't count because it was a VHS projector.
You're right.
So how does it feel to sit and watch it? Because there's a movie in your head that you've never seen, and comparing that to what's there. Do you feel pain? Do you feel aesthetic pain? Do you feel pleased that it's so big?
He's a screenwriter, by the way. I really enjoyed this screening of it. I think it's because I'm here with friends and family and some old friends, and I just let myself sort of get swept up in the film. I didn't feel pain. I felt joy. Yes.
I'm curious how your original vision compared to this ending, because they made a quip about inbreeding, but then there was only one woman left on the island at the end. Are we supposed to assume more people join you to help repopulate civilization?
Of course, more people will join. In fact, that's a big part of the next book. Yes. That whole theme of the epigenesis, needed to be a lot more developed, and it was, and it will be. That is really a very interesting component. Like, what happens to humanity, given those stakes? Yes.
It sounds like you had a very clear vision, kind of starting out. How did you handle when changes were made, or it wasn't like the vision that you saw and other people got involved?
It was sort of surreal. First of all, I was so naive when I first sold the script and then started in the rewriting process. I didn't even know that I was in development hell. And I had no idea that I could be fired and replaced. When they started, I would turn in, draft 4, and, Andy Licht and Jeff Miller, two of the executive producers who were the guys that I knew who ended up getting the script first to John Davis and then to Larry Gordon, said, I think they like your work. There's no talk of you being replaced. And I was like, what are you guys talking about? Replaced? I'm the writer. I had no idea that they go through writers like they're going out of style. They just, writer du jour. And then, the specialist on dialogue, the specialist on women, the specialist on this, the script doctor guy, the Joss Whedon, uncredited, and spent tons of time in Hawaii here. It was a bit of a whirlwind, to be completely honest. My head was spinning, by the time this whole thing, and then it became, this huge production, and I visited the set, and everyone was giving me evil eyes, and, and then going to the premiere, and it was just a bizarre sort of rites of passage thing, and I think I'm still recovering from it.
With the success of the Universal attractions around the world, and with this summer's, mega movie summer celebration, with Jaws' 50th anniversary in 1975, and then Back to the Future 40th anniversary in 1985, we have 1995 Waterworld. Why do you think Universal hasn't really done much with the property over just the stunt shows?
Executives are stupid. I don't know. It baffles me. It baffles me. Clearly, the truth is that most decision making in Hollywood is fear-based. It's what is going to not get me fired. What can we do that's a carbon copy of what we did last year? Let's follow the playbook. Let's do it all from the ego and the formulas, as opposed to the true creativity, which is follow your intuition and your gut, I don't. It kind of baffles me. Like it begs to be remade. I think people were so worried about production, you know, the idea of doing a whole water thing. But for a while they were thinking about doing a TV series, and certainly the technology has gotten to the point where, you know, it's much more feasible to make a movie like this. But, you know, we need them to play ball and to resurrect this. And we actually need all of you. We want to, with Waterworld Reborn, we want to make more than just a popcorn movie or, you know, revive the franchise. We're going to start with a book because that's something that we do control. We do have publishing rights worldwide, but Universal owns overseas rights to Waterworld. And therefore, we need them to play ball. And we're going to make it irresistible, hopefully. And one of the things we want to do is use this movie, which is essentially a popcorn movie, to raise awareness about our oceans, make it a movement more than a movie, talk about water as a human right, get Matt Damon and water.org on board to do something. Maybe he executive produces it or something, but we want to do something very big and very grassroots driven, you know, so we'll see. You know, I have to finish writing the book, so that's step one, but hopefully we can do something collectively that really brings out the full potential of what this whole world and movie could be.
Thank you. Have you considered creating a video game to help you to that end?
That's a great idea, and that's another thing, like, why didn't they make a video game? Especially now with the technology, the immersive technology. So I would say stay tuned for that, too.
Cool. And then I just also wanted to bring back attention to the question of this young teacher that she said, did you have advice to young writers?
Advice to young writers. Okay. So you have to figure out what you want to say, and that's not easy. And it took me, so I mentioned sort of beginner's luck, or beginner's mind, right? Fearlessness, like not just diving in, writing so quickly that it wasn't even me, it just happened, right? That is a gift, and it's a blessing. You know, it's bigger than me. What happened after that was I froze. Like you know, then it was like, oh, now we want your next script. Well, what do I want to say? What's my voice? What matters to me? That it wasn't totally clear. So it begins with this idea of, you know thyself. What's going on in your world? What are you burning to express? And what are the emotions associated with that? And then it doesn't necessarily mean you have to write about your life, but you have to write about the emotional stakes that you know, right? And then you can translate them into a sci-fi universe or whatever you want, but the interactions, there's a story. If you really are a writer, and actually we all have stories to tell, but if you want to express it in written words, then spend time. You know, there's a great book, The Artist's Way, right? Julia Cameron, it's a process to try to help you find what it is that you're here to express. So do the things that nurture that voice. And then you got to be a little fearless and just go for it and let go of perfectionism. Those are my 2 cents.
I'm going to try and word this as easy as possible. But so I know you mentioned the VHS screening, and then there's digital, and there's also a fan cut of the movie. And with all the rewrites, was your original concept with the map tattooed true from how they actually iterated it on screen?
Okay, that is one of the biggest disasters in the movie.
Well,
I
'cause I
hate
heard
that
a
so
rumor.
much. I hate that so much. It's so stupid. And it's talk about Deus Ex Machina. It's worse than the Chitty Chitty Bang Bang floating device. It's like just in the moment of time when we're at 2 hours and 10 minutes of screen time, he's going to figure out, oh, north is south. Oh, let's just do this. There, fly. It's there. Like, give me a frickin' break. I hate that so much. And when I write, I need verisimilitude, a semblance of it being plausible scientifically. And I spent so much time figuring out that map. At one point, there was an eclipse. There was a telescope on the supertanker. They were looking to see the little. I don't want to go into it, but it was much more granular and realish. You know, just the idea of a few numbers and a symbol, and then suddenly it's upside down. I hate that. And no, it needed to be a lot better.
Yeah, well, the rumor I heard was an intern fucked up on the actual design.
What's that?
An intern messed up on the design, and it's like a mixture of kanjis that doesn't make any sense.
It's possible. And the other thing that I really don't like is it seems like there's all these copies of the map. So then why do they need the girl? Just so.
Well, I think that's why they left out the ending of it being Everest, because it didn't make any sense for the actual map. I don't know.
Right. Yeah, that could be.
Well, before we go, I've got one more question in case anybody. Okay, you touched on a little bit about the climate aspect about the story. Could you tell us a little bit about like how this has inspired talks in climate? I believe you were invited to the UN to speak on.
I was. So there's been some real life scientific kind of developments based on the story. So one of them was that Kevin Costner, at one point we described, so the idea that the pirates had, the smoggers had the supertanker and the oil was in there was not in the original. In the original, they were skimming oil. There was some oil gurgling up from the ocean floor, and they were skimming it. And Costner was fascinated by that, and he ended up developing, investing in a startup that salvaged ocean spill up. So it would skimmers and then centrifuges that would separate the oil from the water. And they actually deployed them several times, I think successfully. I'm not sure what's happening to that company right now, but anyway, he was inspired to actually take real life conservation action. And then in 2019, I was invited to the United Nations by a National Geographic reporter who was helping moderate and a roundtable on the idea of floating cities as a possible solution for habitat loss due to climate change and rising oceans. So for instance, in a country like Bangladesh, if the ocean rises 5 feet, we have 10 or 20 million climate refugees. Like, what are you going to do with them? And so the United Nations convened this roundtable, and they hired some heavy-duty futurists, engineers, architects. This guy, Bjarke Engel, who's a pretty well-known Danish architect, conceived of a whole master plan of modular floating cities. There was a model. There was 3D modeling. And the Nat Geo moderator says, Peter, you want to come along? I mean, you were the guy who was writing about this in 1986. And I'm like, sure. And he said, hey, after Bjarke's presentation, I'm going to feed you the first question. Are you up for that? I said, sure. So Bjarke does his presentation, and it's very impressive. And at the end of it, he says, so as you see, this is very well thought out. It is not a disaster like Kevin Costner's Waterworld. And the reporter goes, Peter, you want to comment on that? And I said, I bet you didn't know that the screenwriter of Waterworld would be in the room, Bjarke.
Well, I think it's that time of night. Are there any parting words you want to give everyone?
Well, thanks so much for showing up. It's such a treat. I really appreciate the passion. At first, it was so disorienting, this experience. Like, what did I create? What is this monster? And then realizing that people really do have love and affection for the film. It means a lot to see it like in a setting like this. And I want you guys to stay for the ride, the next iteration, because we're going to hopefully make something even cooler. Woo!
Peter Rader, everybody.
Thanks.